24 hours inside Canada's most secure prison, Millhaven Institution. Behind the Iron Gates. This documentary pulls back the concrete walls of Millhaven Institution, Canada's most secure federal prison, to reveal a world shaped by violence, rebellion, fear, and the crushing weight of confinement. Built in 1971 to replace the notorious Kingston Penitentiary, Millhaven has been host to infamous riots, deadly escapes, prisoner suicides, and systemic abuse. Through decades of court filings, official records, and news reports, we examine how this fortress of steel and stone became both a symbol of state control and a flashpoint for human desperation. This story is a dramatized adaptation inspired by real events. Some names, places, and details have been changed for privacy. They said it was Canada's last line of defense, built to contain the worst of the worst. But on one July night in 1972, 14 inmates cut through that steel fence and vanished into the darkness. For months, the most massive manhunt in Canadian history hunted them down. And inside those walls, violence, desperation, and lives pushed to the brink. This is what happens when you lock people away, and forget what makes them human. The walls rise, birth of a fortress. On a quiet stretch of highway east of Bath, Ontario, the grounds of Millhaven Institution still seem unassuming enough, forested lots, low rolling hills winding toward a small town in the distance. But cross the threshold onto the access road, past the guard stations, the razor wire, the gate, the hulking guard shack, and you enter a world built not for rehabilitation, but for containment, a radial maze of steel and concrete, where every corridor is under watch, and every movement is calculated. Millhaven was officially commissioned in the late 1960s, with construction starting around 1969. Canada Plus 2 Penitentiary Museum Plus 2 The prison opened its doors in 1971. It was designed to be the replacement for the aging Kingston Penitentiary, Ontario's main maximum security facility until that time. Penitentiary Museum Plus 1. The architecture itself feels cold and deliberate. Prisoner accommodations radiate from a central control post, living units forming long spokes, like the arms of a star pressing outward. Movement is strictly controlled, allowed only through that central hub. Canada Plus 1 capacity was roughly 496 adult male offenders. Canada Plus 1. From the outside, Millhaven promised order, discipline, and control. To the government and correctional authorities, it represented a modern approach, a facility built for containment of the most dangerous, violent, or recalcitrant offenders. To many inmates, though, it would become a crucible. The fallout from Kingston, why Millhaven was built. Only months before Millhaven opened, the prison system faced a crisis. The 1971 riot at Kingston Penitentiary, arguably one of the most violent revolts in Canadian prison history, shook public faith in how criminals were confined. Wikipedia Plus 1 dozens of inmates had taken hostages, barricaded wings, and battled guards over days. The net result, violence, chaos, public outrage. In response, authorities vowed the uprising would never be repeated. Part of that promise was the fast-tracking of Millhaven Institution, with modern, smart design meant to prevent the kind of chaos that erupted in Kingston. But for many who were transferred from Kingston to Millhaven, the move felt less like an upgrade and more like a sentence to a darker cell. A photographer who visited both prisons years later called Millhaven a terrible place, with ranges that looked like motel corridors, but where the promise of dignity ended at the door. Agnes Etherington Art Centre Plus 1. Despite the promises of order, the early records of Millhaven reveal that the same tensions that provoked violence in Kingston were simply transplanted, albeit under tighter supervision. Early cracks, violence and the first uprising. Not long after opening, reports began to surface of brutality, abuse, and systemic repression. What many former inmates described as survival mode became part of daily life. In a public record submitted to Parliament, one former inmate of Kingston Penitentiary, moved to Millhaven, compared conditions starkly. Kingston of 1971 hasn't gone away, it's just moved down the road. Wikipedia Plus 1. On April 18, 1971, not even a full year before Millhaven officially accepted large numbers of prisoners, 11 guards were charged by the Ontario Provincial Police with 24 counts of assault causing bodily harm. The charges stemmed from allegations that guards beat incoming prisoners, notably inmates accused of instigating the Kingston riot, as they arrived at Millhaven. Wikipedia Plus 1. According to public records, one of the inmates singled out was a man we'll call John Doe for this story, real name withheld, in original documents under court sealing, or later expunged. He was said to have been beaten so severely on arrival that his skull was fractured, knocked nearly like an egg, before he was forced to run a gauntlet of guards wielding nightsticks. Wikipedia +2 Wikipedia +2. He collapsed. He begged for mercy. He got none. The beating reportedly ended only when he fell unconscious. That was only the beginning. Dozens of other inmates were subject to similar mistreatment, according to that same inquest. In the courtroom that followed, the Crown faced what was then unprecedented scrutiny. For the first time in Canadian history, prison guards were brought to trial for charges of assault causing bodily harm. Wikipedia +1. Still, decades later, many say justice never truly came. Some guards convicted were later reinstated. Others escaped consequences completely. The public outrage faded. But the message, to inmates, was clear. From riot to silence, the struggle for rights. By the mid-1970s, frustration in the prison system had begun to ferment not only as anger, but as organized resistance. On August 10, 1974, a prisoner at Millhaven, let's call him E.N., died by suicide after prolonged isolation in segregation. Wikipedia +1. According to the coroner's inquest, the man had earlier requested a transfer to a non-working unit. Guards responded by sending him to solitary confinement. When outside mental health professionals and advocates asked for more oversight, the administration responded slowly. Internal communications stalled. 10 days passed without clarity. On August 10, N. ended his life. Wikipedia. That suicide would become a catalyst. On the first anniversary of his death, inmates across multiple Canadian prisons, not just Millhaven, mounted hunger strikes in solidarity. The protest became the seed of what would grow into an annual tradition, Prisoners' Justice Day. Scholars Portal +1. Prisoners demanded better treatment, transparency, and recognition of rights inside a system built to erase autonomy. For many, it was the first time their voice, even behind iron bars, mattered. Millhaven's reign as maximum security fortress. From the outside, Millhaven stood as the crown jewel of Canada's maximum security network. It occupies Federal Reserve property on Highway 33, near Bath, Ontario. Canada +1 over the decades, it also housed the Federal Intake Assessment Unit, psychiatric treatment wings, and, for a time, immigration detainees between 2006 and 2012. Canada +1. Its layout, radial, stark, tightly controlled, was meant to prevent organized rebellion. Movement was restricted. Cells were heavily monitored. The guard-to-inmate ratio was high, and solitary confinement was easily employed. Officially, Millhaven was a facility of last resort. Only those classified as maximum security offenders would serve there. 211 Ontario +1. But inside those walls, control meant containment, of bodies, and of psyches. Inmates described the place not as correctional, but as a brutal factory. Echoes of violence, culture of fear and repression. Over time, the environment inside Millhaven bred distrust, aggression, and despair. Reports from human rights investigations, Senate committees, and academic studies painted a grim picture: institutional violence, mental health neglect, overuse of segregation, inadequate food and medical care, and an ever-present sense of dehumanization. Senkanada +2 Justice behind the walls +2. Offenders were reduced to numbers. Prisoners spoke of the back hole, solitary cells so isolated they had almost no contact with other humans, no light, no sound, no hope but time. Guards patrolled like sentinels of abandonment. Some recounted that the guards themselves, rather than offering rehabilitation or guidance, seemed driven by punishment, the screams of fear echoing down corridor after corridor. Several inmates over the years struggled with mental health breakdowns. Some refused food, others attempted escape or self-harm. For many, the question was not just, how long do I have to stay in here, but, how much of myself will I lose before this ends? This was the institutional reality that met every new arrival, a reality far removed from public imaginations of prison sentencing and justice. 1972, the escape that haunted the region. Yet for all the measures, walls, fences, guards, razor wire, Millhaven's early years would be defined not just by internal suppression, but by one of the most infamous escape attempts in Canadian history. On the night of July 10, 1972, just a year after the prison opened, 14 inmates managed to clip a section of the chain-link fence from a recreation yard and slip out into the night. Wikipedia +2 Global News +2. The breakout stunned the local communities and law enforcement. It triggered a massive manhunt, hundreds of police officers, soldiers from the nearby CFB Trenton, and multiple search teams deployed across the province. Wikipedia +1. For residents miles away from the prison, the night meant fear. One woman, living on a farm near Napanee, recounted how her child came running to the house one afternoon with a strange man in tow, a fugitive from Millhaven. She described the moment. "I tried to hold the door from the sun porch. He said, 'I'm not going to hurt anyone, but I would like something to eat, please.'" Global News +1. Over the following months, the hunt stretched on. Teams recovered most escapees. Many were holed up in barns, abandoned houses, remote cottages, hiding among civilians who had Northwest idea danger was close. Only a handful ever slipped beyond the net. According to one local officer involved in the recapture efforts, "It felt like we had company, it was a hostage-taking waiting to happen." Kingstonist. The scandal haunted Millhaven's reputation for years. If a prison built to guarantee security could be breached so easily, so dramatically, what did that say about the fortress's iron walls? Prisoners' Justice Day, From Memory to Movement. The 1972 escape wasn't the only event to etch Millhaven into Canadian history. Just a few years later, after the suicide of the prisoner N. in 1974, the first commemoration of what would become National Prisoners' Justice Day was held on August 10, 1975, by inmates across prisons. Scholars Portal +1. Prisoners used the day not only to remember those lost, but to demand reforms, better mental health support, fair treatment, transparency in disciplinary processes, cessation of torture-style punishments, and humane conditions. What started as a spark of dissent at Millhaven grew into a national symbol of resistance, a reminder that behind every number in a federal registry, there is a human life. To this day, August 10 remains a day of protest and remembrance, both inside and outside Canada's prison walls, a legacy born in Millhaven's shadow. Inside the radial maze. Daily horror behind the concrete. By the mid-1970s, the first half-decade of Millhaven's operation, surviving accounts from inmates, guard reports, and external observers begin to paint a picture of daily life inside that many would call brutal. Cells were cramped. The living units resembled narrow motel corridors, but unlike a motel, there was no concept of privacy, no freedom. Doors were heavy steel, locks were constant, lights were artificial, and windows, if present, offered little more than a narrow slice of sky. According to a post-opening review, every movement, from showers, meals, recreation, to lockdown, was mediated through the central control post. Canada +1. Inmates described psychological pressure, the constant sound of locks, footsteps, clanging metal, intercom voices, the echo of guards' boots, a monotony punctuated by fear and uncertainty. Medical care was sparse, and mental health resources even more so. As reported in a 2017 study before the Senate Committee on Human Rights, prisoners across federal institutions, including Millhaven, complained of inadequate treatment, negligible access to therapy, and overuse of segregation as punishment or control. Canada +1. Food and living conditions added indignities. Meals were mass-produced and poorly rated by inmates, causing many to rely on canteen purchases instead. Compensation for prison labor was paltry, and even that was partially clawed back for room, board, administrative fees, or phone costs. Canada +1. Visitation was limited, social contact rare, and hope, for many, grew dim. It was a world designed to break people. The contradiction, a fortress built for security, but born of violence. The founding narrative of Millhaven was that this new prison would be an improvement, secure, modern, efficient, built to avoid the failures of the past. Instead, within a year of opening, it revealed itself as not a solution, but a continuation of the problem. What changed, from Kingston to Millhaven, was only the skin, the walls, the locks, the architecture. Inside remained the same fears, anger, degradation, brutality. Prisoners circled the drain of despair. Guards, often young and undertrained, wielded power over life and death. And the state, watching from afar, paid lip service to reform even as another violence was quietly institutionalized. By the time the first major escape rocked the prison in 1972, the illusion of control was shattered. And by the mid-1970s, the cracks in the system were exposed not by riots or breakouts, but by suicide, silent resistance, hunger strikes, and the beginning of a movement for prisoner rights. The night 14 men vanished. This story is a dramatized adaptation inspired by real events. Some names, places, and details have been changed for privacy. The night that would haunt Millhaven Institution for decades didn't begin with shouting, alarms, or the chaos that would later spill across Ontario's countryside. It began quietly, eerily so. July 10, 1972. A humid Monday. A moonless sky stretched over the maximum security compound, turning the razor wire into a silhouette of black thorns. Inside the ranges, men paced their cells with the dull rhythm of captivity. Radios hummed behind steel doors, guards murmured down the corridors, and the institution carried on with the predictable monotony of a place designed to suffocate unpredictability. But beneath that stillness, something was coiling. Something that had taken weeks, possibly months, of whispered planning, careful observation, and a level of desperation that pushed 14 inmates to risk death rather than endure another day behind Millhaven's concrete walls. This is the story of a prison break that shattered the illusion of absolute security. A story of dread, violence, human error, and the thin line between order and anarchy. The spark, seeds of desperation. From the day Millhaven opened its gates in 1971, the tension inside was palpable. It was supposed to be Canada's most advanced correctional facility, modern, fortified, and escape-proof. But inmates transferred from Kingston Penitentiary brought with them a reputation for rebellion and a distrust of the system that bordered on hatred. According to historic reports and correctional records, many of the men entering Millhaven felt they were being delivered from one nightmare into another. Guard misconduct trials, allegations of assault on incoming prisoners, solitary confinement used as punishment rather than administration, all of it fostered a culture where inmates believed the institution itself was hostile. One former inmate, quoted years later in a public inquiry, described those early months as closing the door on hope. Another recounted that Millhaven's ranges felt like a machine built to grind you down, with the noise, surveillance, and constant threat of violence gnawing at sanity. In that kind of pressure cooker, escape becomes more than fantasy. It becomes oxygen. The escapees, 14 in total, were not a singular group. According to news reports from the time, several had violent criminal histories, while others were serving long sentences for robbery or weapons charges. Historians still debate whether the plan was an organized operation or a spontaneous opportunity seized by men desperate for freedom. What is certain, according to archived interviews with police and correctional staff, is that the prisoners had noticed a flaw, a literal hole in the institution's armor. A section of chain-link fence near a recreation yard had been weakened. Whether through rust, force, or neglect is still disputed. But the men knew it. And they waited. Night was their ally. Afternoon tension, the calm before the storm. Hours before the escape, guards later reported a strange stillness across the ranges. Not silence, there's no such thing inside a maximum security prison, but a strange quiet of intent. Little things were off. In one unit, 2 inmates who usually kept to themselves were seen whispering near the showers. In another, a man who routinely picked fights was uncharacteristically subdued. A guard supervisor would later testify that several inmates seemed unusually cooperative, almost polite, an ominous shift that nobody understood until it was too late. It's common in high-security facilities for guards to rely on instinct as much as procedure. Many who had worked in Kingston Penitentiary before the transfer said you could feel when something was brewing. Millhaven, newer and more orderly on paper, made reading the atmosphere harder. Observation towers removed guards from close interaction. Segregated control points reduced direct contact. And the physical layout, the radial spokes of ranges spreading out from a central hub, created blind spots in human intuition. So when small irregularities showed themselves, they were dismissed as coincidence. But to the inmates preparing to breach the walls, time was now measured in heartbeats. Nightfall in the yard. Summer nights in Ontario carry a thickness to them. The kind that hovers in the air and turns every sound heavy. As dusk faded into a black void, the yard lights cast a yellow glow across the concrete and fences. Guards in the watchtowers leaned forward occasionally, scanning the ground below, but visibility was limited. Earlier in the evening, a group of inmates had been authorized for a short recreation period. Reports confirmed that several of the eventual escapees were among them. What happened in those moments would later be reconstructed through court filings, interviews, and accounts from correctional staff. The prisoners approached the weakened fence segment, camouflaged by shadows, and worked at it quietly, methodically. Whether they used tools smuggled from workshops or simply brute force remains uncertain. Some historians believe a metal cutting instrument was introduced into the yard, others argue the fence had been compromised long before. But what is verified is this. A section of the chain link mesh was loose enough to be peeled back. All they needed was darkness. And timing. When the recreation period ended, the opening remained invisible to guards. The men returned to their cells, hearts pounding, knowing the moment of truth was coming. What must it have felt like? The weight of a plan too dangerous to abandon. The fear of being caught before it began. The knowledge that a single miscalculation could mean death, whether from guards' rifles, attack dogs, or the unforgiving terrain outside the perimeter. But for many of them, the risk was worth it. Anything was. Lockdown, but not order. Millhaven at night was a world of steel echoes. The sound of heavy doors slamming shut bounced through corridors like thunder. Intercoms crackled. Guards cycled through their rounds. After 10 p.m., activity slowed to a crawl. For most inmates, night was a time of restless waiting, counting hours, replaying memories, fantasizing about freedom. But on this night, 14 men were awake with a different purpose. It's unclear exactly how they slipped from their ranges and into the yard undetected. Some reports suggest they manipulated door mechanisms. Others claim an error in unit checks gave them a window. A former guard interviewed decades later speculated that inmates had timed the rounds precisely, exploiting a gap of minutes. Minutes were all they needed. Just after 11 p.m., according to historical accounts, the first inmate slid through the loose section of fence. One witness later described the moment as like watching shadows detach from the ground. One man squeezed through, then another. Within minutes, a chain of bodies silently passed into the night air beyond the recreation yard. 14 men. 14 fugitives. Their feet touched grass outside the perimeter, a place no convict should ever be. And then they ran. The alarm that came too late. A few minutes after the escape, a guard in a tower noticed something unusual, a disturbance near the base of the fence, movement, perhaps, or the faint warping of metal. He squinted, leaned forward, then realized the unthinkable. The fence wasn't intact. And the shapes moving across the dark field weren't animals. He hit the alarm. Sirens exploded across the compound, blaring into the night with a pitch that cut through the silence like a blade. Lights snapped on. Guards shouted over intercoms, boots thundered down corridors, and inmates jolted awake to chaos. But the fugitives were already far from the yard, sprinting toward the tree line that bordered the federal property. Their silhouettes flickered in and out of darkness, moving like ghosts across the landscape. Millhaven's most critical security breach had just begun. The wild hunt begins. Within 30 minutes, local law enforcement had been notified. Officers from the Ontario Provincial Police, RCMP, and military personnel from CFB Trenton were mobilized. The escape dwarfed anything the region had experienced before. According to contemporary news reports, police checkpoints went up across eastern Ontario, roadblocks were established on major routes, and officers began combing fields, rail corridors, and forests. A senior police official at the time described it as the largest manhunt in Canadian history up to that point. And while authorities scrambled, residents awoke to the news with dread. Families locked their doors. Farmers kept rifles by the back window. Parents kept children inside. Across radio stations, the same warning repeated hourly: 14 dangerous convicts at large. Stay alert. Stay inside. Report anything unusual. But danger had already arrived on several doorsteps. Encounter at the farmhouse. One of the most documented incidents occurred on a rural property near Napanee. A woman, identified only by first name in news archives, recounted an encounter that still chills listeners. Her young son had run from the yard, breathless, saying a man was following him. When she opened the kitchen door, she saw him, a gaunt, sweating figure, clothes torn, eyes frantic. one of the escapees. She tried to slam the door, but the men caught it and held it, gently at first, then firmly. "I'm not going to hurt anyone," he said, according to her interview decades later. "I just want something to eat." Even now, the quote echoes with a strange mix of fear and humanity. She held firm, refusing to open the door. The men eventually backed away. But the experience left her trembling for years. This moment, simple, terrifying, intimate, captured the public's imagination. For many, it embodied the vulnerability felt across the region, the idea that danger could appear quietly on any porch, any night. Into the woods, survival versus capture. The escapees quickly learned that freedom outside Millhaven's walls was no guarantee of survival. They were exhausted, hungry, and unfamiliar with the terrain. They had no supplies beyond what they carried on their bodies. And the countryside they sprinted into was vast, open, and dotted with small farms and surveillance. Some broke into smaller groups. Others went alone. According to police reports, 2 men traveled through marshland, leaving tracks visible from the air. Another pair sought refuge in an abandoned barn, lighting a small fire that gave away their position. Others attempted to hitchhike, one even flagged down a driver who recognized him from the news and alerted authorities. Within 24 hours, several fugitives were back in custody. Captured near creeks. On rural roads. Hiding under brush. But the manhunt stretched far longer than a single day. For weeks, officers continued to sweep the region. Helicopters buzzed overhead. Search dogs combed ravines and woodland. Farmers reported missing food from storage sheds, footprints in fields, or cigarette butts left near barns. Across this landscape, every shadow became a suspect. Every broken fence, a clue. Every rustle in the trees, a heartbeat of fear. The human side of escape. What drove these men to risk everything? Their motives varied. According to psychological analyses and court records, some felt they had nothing to lose. Sentences so long they saw no future. Conditions so degrading they feared staying more than fleeing. Others were impulsive, opportunists who cared more about the moment than the consequences. A few were planners, men with meticulous minds who studied guard patterns, weakened infrastructure, and timing. They were not reckless so much as calculating. But behind every escape attempt is one universal motive, the unrelenting human desire for freedom. Freedom from confinement. Freedom from violence. Freedom from the loss of self. Millhaven, especially in its earliest years, eroded identity. Inmates spoke of forgetting their names, losing track of days, feeling themselves become a number instead of a person. To escape, even if only for hours, was a reclamation of something stolen. For some, it was a final gasp of control. For others, it was survival. Fear spreads beyond the walls. As days passed, fears outside the prison grew more pronounced. The press followed every new capture with urgency. Millhaven fugitive spotted near rural home, one headline read. Another warned, escapees still at large, public urged to stay vigilant. Residents maintained curfews. Churches held prayer gatherings. Parents escorted children to school. Many reported sleeping with lights on. Police advised locking barns, sheds, vehicles, anything that might offer shelter or tools. Meanwhile, inside Millhaven, the atmosphere was electric with fallout. Warden offices lit up late into the night. Guard briefings doubled. Internal investigations began immediately. Staff were furious. How could a facility built for absolute security have failed so catastrophically? Some guards suspected inside help. Others blamed understaffing or flawed design. Still others pointed to the aftermath of the Kingston Penitentiary riot, arguing that the rushed opening of Millhaven created vulnerabilities never corrected. Whoever was at fault, the institution's leadership now faced the impossible task of restoring public trust. Recapture, one by one. Over the following weeks and months, escapees continued to surface. One was found sleeping in a storage shed behind a hardware store. Another attempted to steal a car but was caught when the owner returned unexpectedly. A third, exhausted and starving, surrendered to police at a roadside gas station, telling officers he couldn't run anymore. According to reports, most were captured within a short radius of the prison. Their lack of preparation, combined with the intensity of the search, made long-term escape almost impossible. Ontario's terrain favored pursuers, open fields, tangled forests, small towns with residents quick to report anything suspicious. Several escapees were brought back to Millhaven in shackles, escorted by heavily armed officers. Crowds gathered in some cases, watching silently as the men were dragged back into the very fortress they had slipped through just days earlier. A handful were captured weeks later, thin and near collapse. Only a couple made it significantly farther, but even they were eventually found. In the end, the manhunt succeeded. Every escapee was accounted for. But the damage, to public confidence, to Millhaven's reputation, and to the psyche of both inmates and guards, had already taken root. Inside Millhaven after the escape. The prison locked down. Hard. Segregation units filled. Privileges were suspended. Searches were relentless: cells, communal spaces, workshops, personal belongings. Guards conducted extra rounds. Surveillance increased. Punishments were severe. Inmates spoke of a suffocating tension that lasted months. Even those uninvolved in the escape felt the repercussions. Violence between guards and inmates increased. Mental health incidents spiked. The administration, fearing further rebellion, tightened its fist around the entire population. For some prisoners, hope evaporated entirely. This is the moment historians cite as the turning point, the instant Millhaven shifted from a facility already troubled to one defined by harshness. The escape became the lens through which every decision was made: security first, humanity second. Political fallout and public outrage. The escape ignited a national conversation about prison security, criminal justice, and the direction of Canada's correctional system. Newspaper editorials condemned the facility's management. Politicians demanded explanations. Public officials spoke of unacceptable oversight failures. Some even questioned whether Millhaven, built to replace the chaos at Kingston, was itself a flawed design. A correctional services report released afterward acknowledged structural and procedural weaknesses, though many details remained sealed or redacted. What is clear is that reforms were proposed: heightened perimeter security, increased guard training, updated surveillance protocols. But as with many systemic issues, changes came slowly. Still, the escape left a stain that couldn't be scrubbed away. For years, residents living near the prison would speak in hushed tones of that summer, when danger crept into their farmhouses and fields, when helicopters thundered overhead nightly, when the countryside felt like the stage of a crime thriller. And in truth, it was. The legacy of July 10, 1972. Decades later, when historians revisit the Millhaven escape, they see more than a dramatic prison break. They see a moment of collective reckoning, a clash between institutional power and human desperation. The escape exposed the fragility of so-called maximum security. Even Canada's most fortified unit had weaknesses. The consequences of systemic neglect. Inmates driven to escape often don't flee because they expect success, they flee because staying feels worse. The ripple effect of prison conditions on the outside world. Citizens far beyond the walls felt the aftershocks. The undeniable human instinct to run toward freedom. Even at staggering cost. In the public imagination, the story lives on because it's more than the sum of its events. It's a symbol of fear, defiance, failure, and the eternal battle between control and chaos. The men behind the headlines. Though names of the escapees were published in contemporary news reports, this adaptation uses pseudonyms to protect privacy. What matters isn't their identities, it's their lives, choices, and the forces that shape them. Some were violent criminals. Some were not. All were trapped in a system wrestling with its own brutality. Interviews with former guards reveal a complicated truth: many staff were shaken, not merely because men escaped, but because it signaled something deeper, that the institution's control was an illusion. That despite walls, towers, and razor wire, the human will remained unpredictable. One retired officer said decades later, "We thought Millhaven would be unbreakable. That night proved us wrong." A prison transformed. In the years following the escape, Millhaven evolved. Security hardened. Policies shifted. Surveillance technology improved. The institution gained a reputation for intense control, one that still persists today. But the story of that night continues to echo through its corridors, carried by the memories of staff, the whispers of inmates, and the written record preserved in archives across Canada. The escape was not just a moment of failure. It was a mirror held up to the system, reflecting both its flaws and its human consequences. 14 men ran into the darkness. 14 stories collided with the landscape of a fearful province. 14 footsteps became the soundtrack of a national scandal. But behind every headline was a truth no prison could contain. When people feel caged beyond breaking, even the thickest walls cannot hold them. The escape of 1972 didn't just expose a weakness in Millhaven's perimeter. It detonated a psychological bomb inside the institution that would reshape daily life for decades. When 14 men slipped through the fence and vanished into the darkness, the prison didn't merely tighten its security protocols, it hardened its identity. The place that was already designed to be Canada's most unyielding fortress evolved into something even more severe, a machine of total control. To understand Millhaven after the escape is to understand a system obsessed with eliminating unpredictability. It is to walk ranges where silence is demanded, where every movement is recorded, where trust is a liability, and where human behavior is shaped by fear as much as regulation. The prison's architecture, routines, punishments, and unwritten rules formed an ecosystem designed to pressure-cook the human mind. And in the years that followed, inmates and guards alike would discover just how unforgiving that ecosystem could become. This is not a story about violence alone, though violence was constant. It is about the slow crushing of identity, the battle for psychological survival, and the tension between institutional order and human chaos. It is about the machine, how it ran, whom it consumed, and who managed to stay sane within it. The atmosphere after the escape. In the weeks immediately following the escape, Millhaven felt like a war zone without gunfire. The administration declared a full lockdown, cells sealed, movement halted, every inch of the prison treated as a potential crime scene. Officers walked ranges with an intensity that bordered on paranoia. The trust that should have existed between staff and inmate populations, already thin, was now gone completely. According to later testimony from correctional staff, the first 72 hours after the escape were pure chaos, emergency briefings every few hours, rapid audits of locks and doors, rushed repairs to the damaged fence line, and widespread suspicion that inmates had help from the inside. Investigators interviewed guards and prisoners alike, turning informal conversations into interrogations. Some staff felt personally responsible, others responded with anger, doubling down on control. But the most important shift was deeper than procedures. A psychological wound had been opened. The very reason Millhaven existed, to prevent the kind of uprising and disorder that had erupted in Kingston, was suddenly in question. A guard who worked at Millhaven in the 1970s later said, "The escape didn't break the prison. It broke the illusion we were running it." In response, the institution became more rigid, more guarded, more suspicious. And inmates felt that change immediately. A day inside Millhaven, the structure of control. By the mid-1970s, a day in Millhaven was not simply a schedule, it was a lesson in compliance. Every minute had purpose, and every purpose was containment. Morning count happened before dawn. The loud clank of metal doors and shouted numbers reverberated off concrete walls. Inmates rose before their bodies or minds were ready, blinking under harsh fluorescent lights that never fully turned off. The count wasn't just to ensure no one else had escaped, it reinforced that prisoners existed as inventory, not individuals. Breakfast followed. A quick march through corridors under watchful eyes, trays slid across counters, meals eaten in a setting where tension sat at every table. Some men barely touched their food, not from lack of hunger but because eating in the presence of enemies, gang-affiliated or otherwise, meant vulnerability. Work assignments came next, though work was often a generous term. Workshops for those approved. Cleaning duties for others. For many in maximum security, especially those designated high-risk or disruptive, work was a privilege they would never see. Their days were spent in cells barely larger than a walk-in closet, reading, pacing, or staring at the wall. Recreation was limited, watched from towers and ground-level officers, every movement scrutinized. If tensions ran high, recreation was cancelled without explanation. If an inmate looked at an officer the wrong way, privileges vanished. And at the center of it all was segregation, the most feared and most common form of discipline. Segregation, the hole inside the fortress. Segregation in Millhaven was not just a location. it was a philosophy. Inmates described the segregation block as a place where sound behaved strangely, echoing at times, disappearing at others. A place where light remained artificial and time had no texture. A place where conversations happened through vents or not at all. The cell was a concrete box with a steel door, a metal bed, a toilet, and enough space for a human body but not a human life. It was not meant to punish violence alone, it was meant to control thought. After the 1972 escape, segregation became even more central to the institution's governance. If a guard suspected an inmate was planning something, segregation. If a prisoner mouthed off, segregation. If there was tension between ranges, segregation preemptively swept up anyone considered influential. A former prisoner, identified only as M in a post-release interview, said, "You didn't have to do something wrong. You just had to be someone the guards didn't trust." In segregation, the rules changed. Showers were offered 3 times per week. Exercise meant pacing alone in a caged yard. Meals slid through a slot. Human contact was nearly zero. Some inmates screamed to hear their own voices. Others crawled along the floor simply to feel movement. Many lost their grip on time, some lost their grip on reality. A correctional ombudsman who reviewed segregation practices in federal institutions said the most devastating thing about solitary was not the silence, but the way it amplified the noise inside your own mind. For Millhaven, segregation was a pressure valve. For prisoners, it was the machine's darkest chamber. The guard-inmate dynamic, a system built on suspicion. Guards at Millhaven lived with their own fears. The escape had proven that inmates were not passive occupants in a controlled environment, they were active participants capable of collaboration, manipulation, and audacity. Many officers responded by adopting a position of constant vigilance. Training emphasized control tactics, body language, use of force guidelines, and situational awareness. But training could never fully prepare officers for ranges filled with men serving life sentences, men with mental health struggles, men with little to lose. Some guards believed the only effective approach was intimidation. Others favored a professional distance. A few attempted compassion, though doing so risked being viewed as weak by colleagues and manipulative by inmates. One officer, speaking anonymously years later, said, "There were days you walked a range and felt like prey. And days you felt like a predator. Neither felt right." The psychological burden on staff was enormous. Officers worked long shifts behind the same walls as prisoners, breathing the same recycled air, absorbing the same tension. The institution didn't offer much mental health support in those years, and burnout was rampant. Some officers left within months. Others stayed decades and carried their stress home, where families felt the impact. The violence inside Millhaven often bled into the lives of those tasked with enforcing its rules. Suspicion became the defining theme of guard-inmate interactions. Every conversation was a negotiation. Every request a potential manipulation. Every act of kindness a calculated risk. And in that environment, misunderstandings could spiral quickly. Violence as communication. Violence in Millhaven was not random, it was a language. Inmates used it to assert dominance, send messages, retaliate against perceived disrespect, or protect themselves in a world where vulnerability could be fatal. Guards used it to quell threats, maintain order, or, according to numerous allegations over the years, punish defiance. A shove could mean warning. A fight could mean revenge. A stabbing could mean that a new hierarchy had been established. Violence erupted in places predictable and unpredictable: showers, exercise yards, meal lines, even during seemingly mundane walkthroughs. Weapons were fashioned from anything: metal filings, toothbrushes, sharpened plastic, fragments of furniture. Contraband circulated despite strict security because ingenuity thrived under deprivation. After the escape, administration believed forceful control was necessary. But brute containment doesn't eliminate violence, it reshapes it. Inmates who once might have expressed frustration through negotiation or collective petition now saw aggression as the only effective tool. A former prisoner using the pseudonym Lennox told a documentary crew, "You push a man into a corner long enough, he either breaks or he bites." In Millhaven, nobody wanted to be the one who broke. Mental health, a crisis in slow motion. Long before Canada formally acknowledged the crisis of mental illness in federal prisons, Millhaven was living it. Isolation. Constant stress. Overcrowding. Violence. Lack of therapeutic resources. Prolonged segregation. All of it created an environment where psychological damage wasn't occasional, it was routine. Men entered the institution with trauma and left with deeper scars. Some developed paranoia or hallucinations. Others sank into depression so profound it became indistinguishable from hopelessness. Suicide attempts were not common, but they were not rare either, especially among prisoners who had spent lengthy periods in segregation. One inmate, J.T., spent over 9 months in solitary during the late 1970s. According to a roommate years later, J.T. emerged talking to shadows and unable to tolerate being around other inmates. He eventually requested a return to segregation because he feared the open ranges more. That detail is the tragedy of the machine. Once a man adapts to deprivation, normal human interaction becomes a threat. The prison wasn't designed to heal psychological wounds. It wasn't even designed to understand them. In those years, mental health resources were minimal, sometimes non-existent. Staff referred to inmates in crisis as disruptive, which meant discipline, not treatment. These decisions often deepened illness. And because officials feared another riot or escape, they were hesitant to loosen the grip on anyone perceived as unstable. The system answered pain with pressure. Informants, enforcers, and the unwritten laws. Where control exists, resistance forms. And where resistance forms, systems of influence grow in the shadows. After the escape, Millhaven saw the rise of two powerful forces, inmate hierarchies and informal networks. Informants, or snitches, operated in dangerous waters. Some sought protection. Others sought leverage. Their whispers shaped guard responses, investigations, and even segregation placements. But being labeled an informant was a death sentence on many ranges. Rumors alone could get a man attacked. Enforcers, inmates with physical dominance or gang ties, maintained order on the prisoner's side of the balance. They mediated disputes, imposed punishments, and enforced rules that existed independently of the institution's laws. Everyone knew the unwritten codes. Never show weakness. Never disrespect. Never involve guards unless death is on the line. Never betray the range. These rules kept the prisoner social system from collapsing under pressure. But they also created a climate where fear governed behavior as much as loyalty did. Guards knew about these systems but rarely intervened unless violence crossed a certain line. In some cases, the informal inmate order made their jobs easier. In others, it made them infinitely harder. The machine wasn't just the institution, it was the people inside it, operating in parallel worlds of power and survival. The echo of Kingston. Though Millhaven had been built to replace Kingston Penitentiary, the trauma of Kingston never truly disappeared. Many of the men inside Millhaven had lived through the Kingston riot. They carried its memories like invisible tattoos, the screams, the beatings, the fear of retaliation. Those experiences shaped expectations at Millhaven. Inmates assumed violence could erupt at any moment. Guards assumed inmates were capable of coordinated rebellion at any time. That mutual suspicion kept the temperature inside the institution permanently elevated. Some prisoners still spoke of Kingston in whispers, as if recounting a battlefield story. Others refused to mention it. But its shadow lingered, feeding the belief that Millhaven could erupt too, and that constant discipline was necessary to prevent it. This mindset justified harsh practices. It also prevented meaningful reform. The machine becomes self-sustaining. By the early 1980s, Millhaven had fully transformed into a system that no longer reacted to the escape, it lived in reaction. Procedures were written to eliminate chaos. Schedules were engineered to minimize interaction. Punishments became standard. Surveillance increased. What emerged was a self-perpetuating machine. Fear created control. Control created resistance. Resistance justified more control. And inside that cycle, human behavior warped. Prisoners became hyper-aware of their surroundings, developing instincts sharpened by constant threat. Guards internalized stress until vigilance became their default state. Communication between the two sides became purely transactional. Once the machine reached this stage, nobody questioned whether it could run differently. It simply ran. The deeper you travel into Millhaven's post-escape era, the more the institution resembles a living organism, one that adapted to threat by growing sharper teeth and thicker skin. By the 1980s and into the 1990s, the prison had become a place where every second carried weight, where every interaction contained subtext, and where the machine of control, once set in motion, no longer required external pressure to keep grinding. It ran on the momentum of its own design. Part 2 of this chapter pulls you deeper inside that machine. Into the unwritten rules that govern the ranges, the quiet evolution of surveillance, the psychology of officers under perpetual tension, and the chilling realization that in a place built to confine the dangerous, the institution itself could become dangerous in its methods. This is not a story of escape or riots or headline moments. It is the slow burn of daily life under maximum security, a system that shapes men from the inside out, whether they wear boots or shackles. The evolution of surveillance, seeing without being seen. After the 1972 escape, Millhaven's administration realized that the old model of perimeter-focused security was insufficient. The escape had not been the result of a bold Hollywood-style plan. It had been simple: observation, opportunity, and speed. So the prison shifted inward, toward omnipresence. By the 1980s, new layers of surveillance transformed the environment. Closed-circuit cameras appeared in ranges, corridors, and yards, always present, often unnoticed, sometimes deliberately conspicuous. Mirrored observation domes allowed guards to see around blind corners, preventing ambushes and catching inmates unaware. Elevated catwalks provided overhead vantage points, letting officers observe without entering the danger zone on foot. Electronic door systems replaced some manual locks, reducing the vulnerability of staff physically turning keys in crowded spaces. The intent was clear: eliminate unpredictability. But unpredictability is part of being human, and the more the institution tried to suppress it, the more it manifested in subtle resistance. Inmates learned the rhythms of the cameras. They knew which lenses jerked slightly when rotating, which had a delay between sweeps, and which offered shadow pockets perfect for brief exchanges of contraband or conversation. One former prisoner, using the pseudonym Rico, described Millhaven's surveillance not as oppressive but as a game. They watched us. We watched them watch us. In this cat-and-mouse dynamic, both sides became hyper-aware. Guards trained their eyes on twitchy shoulders, dropped gazes, and sudden silence. Inmates trained theirs on guard patterns, distracted officers, and loopholes in the surveillance system. The machine didn't stop interaction, it made every interaction tactical. Control through routine, the clock as warden. You can lock a man behind steel bars, but it is routine that truly confines him. Millhaven's schedule hardened in the years after the escape, becoming rigid to the point of ritual. The exact times varied over the decades, but the philosophy remained consistent. Control the clock, and you control the men. Morning count. Breakfast. Range unlock. Movement. Work. Lockdown. Lunch. Lockdown. Recreation. Lockdown. Supper. Lockdown. Final count. Lights out. The repetition created a psychological loop. Some men became numb. Others became agitated. A few. Those who couldn't endure routine broke down entirely. The monotony was not accidental. It was a management strategy. Predictable schedules reduce opportunities for violence and coordination among inmates. But predictability also erodes individuality. One inmate compared it to living inside a metronome. Another said he measured life not in days or months but in how many more times the door would open before I stopped caring. Guards, too, lived by the rhythm. Their shift rotations, briefing schedules, meal breaks, and patrols followed strict patterns. The routine kept them safe but also wore them down. The difference was that guards could go home at the end of the day. Inmates went back into the same loop, with no alternative reality to escape into. Guard psychology, living behind the walls without a sentence. The public often imagines guards as either authoritarian enforcers or hardened veterans immune to stress. Reality at Millhaven was far more complex. Guards lived in a constant state of tension, part vigilance, part adrenaline, part exhaustion. Their environment required two contradictory traits. Empathy, to understand human behavior and de-escalate situations. Detachment, to avoid becoming vulnerable or manipulated. Balancing the two was nearly impossible. A correctional officer interviewed in the late 1990s said, "The job changes you without asking." You start scanning every room you enter, even outside work. You stand with your back to walls. You evaluate people by threat before personality. Officers experienced sleep disruption because hypervigilance doesn't turn off. Irritability due to constant emotional defense. Emotional numbing to cope with trauma exposure. Family strain as stress leaked into home life. Isolation because few people outside felt safe to confide in. Burnout was not a risk, it was an expected outcome. And yet, guards kept working. Some because it was stable employment. Others because they believed in structure, or order, or second chances. A few because they adapted so intimately to prison life that leaving felt unimaginable. In many ways, the longest-serving guards became as institutionalized as the inmates. Power and respect, the unwritten currency of the range. Inside Millhaven, official rules mattered. But unofficial rules mattered more. Respect was not politeness. Respect was survival. A guard who barked orders without legitimacy risked being tested. One who treated inmates unpredictably risked being targeted. Inmates watched for weaknesses, not always to exploit them, but to understand their environment. Conversely, inmates who failed to maintain a posture of confidence risked being marginalized or preyed upon by others. A man who couldn't hold eye contact in the yard might lose access to communal protection. A man who apologized too often could find himself bullied. A man who disclosed personal concerns might see that information weaponized. This unspoken economy shaped daily life. Tone mattered. Body language mattered. Timing mattered. Even silence had a weight to it. New prisoners often learned the rules from older inmates who acted as informal tutors. Keep your head down, your mouth shut, and your word good, they would say. That's the only armor you get. Guards, too, learned the range's culture. Officers who respected the inmates' informal system, without endorsing it, found fewer conflicts. Those who tried to bulldoze through it often faced resistance, sabotage, or eruptions of violence. Millhaven was not just structured by policy. It was governed by an unspoken equilibrium. The role of fear, weapon, deterrent, and survival tool. Fear inside a prison is not a single emotion, it is a social currency. Prisoners feared unpredictable violence. Retaliation for breaking unwritten rules. Guards who held grudges. Transfers to segregation. Losing access to family contact. Guards feared inmate manipulation. Sudden attacks. Institutional failure. Public scrutiny. Internal betrayal. Their own stress boiling over. Fear motivated compliance, but it also motivated defiance. Some inmates acted aggressively to project an image of invulnerability. Others carried themselves with stoic detachment, using silence as a shield. A few became so overwhelmed by fear that they asked for solitary confinement to escape it, a paradox that underscores the machine's brutality. Fear wasn't only emotional. It was strategic. An inmate might intimidate a newcomer to secure dominance. A guard might selectively enforce rules to maintain edge. A man might cultivate a reputation for unpredictability purely as a means of self-preservation. Fear shaped behavior. It shaped relationships. It shaped the entire atmosphere. The machine didn't eliminate fear, it fed on it. Contraband, order hidden within disorder. No matter how strict the institution became, contraband always found its way inside. Not because guards were incompetent, but because human ingenuity thrives under restriction. Contraband flowed through visits. Corrupt intermediaries. Mail. Release and return work programs. Ingenuity within the workshops. Common contraband included tobacco and lighters. Makeshift weapons. Pills. Homemade alcohol. Razor fragments. Improvised tattoo equipment. Notes or coded messages. Contraband wasn't simply recreational, it was functional. Tobacco became currency. Painkillers became coping mechanisms. Blades became tools of negotiation. Alcohol became celebration or escape. Messages became power shifts in the social hierarchy. Possession carried consequences, but the desire outweighed the risks. In an environment deprived of comfort and autonomy, contraband restored a sense of choice, however small. The institution cracked down hard, but the more Millhaven tightened its grip, the more inventive contraband networks grew. Inmates described it as the only market where everything is illegal and everything is necessary. The architecture of tension. Millhaven's physical layout was designed for maximum control, but its structure also amplified psychological strain. The radial, spoke design meant that sound traveled strangely, echoes from one range could bounce to another. Guards in central hubs could see every corridor, giving inmates a sense of being perpetually observed. Natural light was minimal, creating sensory deprivation. Air circulation was mechanical and sterile. Ranges often smelled of disinfectant, sweat, steel, and stale food. Prisons are sensory environments, and Millhaven's senses, its sounds, smells, and rhythms, reinforced containment on a visceral level. One man described it as living in an airless throat. Another said the architecture felt like being inside a body that's always clenching. The building wasn't just where the machine lived. It was the machine. The cycle of punishment, how the machine maintains order. Punishment at Millhaven didn't rely on brutality alone. It relied on predictability. If violence erupted in a range, everyone was locked down. Privileges were suspended. Recreation was cancelled. Showers were limited. Mail was delayed. If an inmate challenged authority, segregation. Cell searches. Loss of canteen. Loss of visits. Psychological pressure. Punishment created deterrence, but it also deepened resentment. The system's aim wasn't rehabilitation, it was stability. Control. Prevention of unpredictability. But controlling humans is never a perfect science. The more the system clamped down, the more pressure built beneath the surface. Institutional memory, the machine has a long memory. Millhaven didn't forget the escape. It didn't forget the suicides. It didn't forget the riots at Kingston. It didn't forget the investigations, or the headlines, or the political scrutiny. Every new policy, every new piece of training, every new piece of surveillance was influenced by the institution's memories, collective trauma encoded into procedural doctrine. But the men inside the prison, both officers and inmates, carried their own memories too. The sound of a stabbing. The fear of a lockdown. The humiliation of segregation. The grief of losing friends. The uncertainty of unpredictable violence. These memories became part of the ecosystem. Inmates taught new inmates. Guards trained new guards. Everyone inherited the machine. And in that inheritance, the past never stayed past. If the first two parts of this chapter revealed how Millhaven controlled bodies and movements, then this part reveals the deeper truth: the prison's most powerful machinery wasn't made of steel or concrete. It was psychological. What happened inside the walls didn't just shape daily routines, it reshaped minds, identities, and the very fabric of human behavior. The brutality that people saw from the outside was only the surface of a much more intimate war, a war fought internally, silently, often invisibly, until the consequences became too loud to ignore. This is the story of how men changed inside the machine. How they adapted, how they cracked, how they hardened, and how they survived. And how, in rare moments, humanity managed to pierce the armor. The psychic weight of maximum security. Imagine a world where every action is watched, every movement controlled, every choice limited. Where the worst day of your life is not an outlier but the baseline. That's the psychological foundation of Millhaven. In many prisons, routine shapes the mind. But Millhaven's routine doesn't just shape, it pressurizes. A prisoner once described it as living inside a clenched fist. Another said, you start feeling like time isn't moving forward, it's circling around you. Psychologists who later studied high-security environments noted a pattern among long-term inmates. Flattened emotional range. Hypervigilance. Loss of personal identity. Heightened aggression as self-preservation. Fragmented memory. Time distortion. Persistent anxiety even after release. None of this is unique to Millhaven. But Millhaven, at least in its early decades, did not simply create these symptoms. It amplified them. And perhaps nothing had greater impact on the prison psyche than segregation. Solitary confinement, the mind's unmaking. Segregation, or the hole, as inmates called it, was not merely a punishment. It was a test of mental endurance. An experiment in deprivation. A typical segregation cell was bare. A steel bed. A thin mattress. A toilet. A small desk. A heavy door. A slot for food. And, sometimes, a narrow window so poorly placed that it provided light but no view. Daily life in segregation was measured in sensations. The hum of fluorescent lights. The scrape of a meal tray. Footsteps that passed by without stopping. The sound of your own breath. Inmates who spent long periods in segregation often reported auditory distortions. Whispers that weren't there. Voices behind the walls. Echoes they swore carried meaning. These were not delusions born of psychosis, these were the brain's desperate attempts to create stimuli in a sensory-starved environment. A composite inmate, pseudonym Darren, once told a prison chaplain. Segregation doesn't make you lose your mind. It makes you watch it melt. Some men adapted. Some embraced solitude, using it as armor. Others shattered quickly, within days. One documented case involved an inmate who tore his mattress apart, convinced cockroaches were crawling beneath his skin. There were no cockroaches. It was the mind inventing something to fight against. Another inmate paced in perfect squares for hours each day, footstep, turn, repeating the pattern until guards said he could walk it blindfolded. For those already struggling with mental illness, segregation was gasoline on a wildfire. Yet the institution relied on it heavily, because segregation was the one tool that gave guards total control. In a place where violence was constant, segregation felt like the only way to create order. But every time the prison used it, the machine grew a little louder. Identity rewritten, how men become symbols. Inside Millhaven, inmates were not just people, they were roles. A man entering the system quickly discovered that his identity in the outside world meant almost nothing here. Instead, the ranges assigned him a new identity based on his crime, his sentence, his demeanor, his alliances, his willingness to stand up for himself, his ability, or inability, to follow unwritten rules, his reputation from other institutions. Millhaven was not just a place where men served time, it was a place where their sense of self was rewritten. A first-time offender might arrive timid and overwhelmed. Within months, he might adopt the hardened facial expression of a man twice his age. Not because he wanted to, but because the machine required it. An older inmate, pseudonym Reynolds, once told a young newcomer, "If you come in here smiling, they'll break you. If you come in here angry, they'll bury you. You gotta come in here empty. Fill up with what you need." This wasn't philosophy. It was survival strategy. Many inmates developed what psychologists call institutional personality. A blank expression to avoid showing emotion. Minimal verbal responses. Slow, deliberate movements. A constant readiness to defend themselves. A distrust of everyone, staff and inmates alike. But the most striking transformation wasn't physical or behavioral. It was moral dislocation. Inside Millhaven, men created their own moral codes. Actions that would seem unthinkable outside became necessary inside. Loyalty became currency. Retaliation became justice. Silence became honor. Violence became communication. And slowly, day by day, these new codes replaced the ones men entered with. Institutionalization, when the machine becomes home. There's a term for what happens when a man becomes so adapted to prison life that he cannot function without it: institutionalization. It is not melodramatic. It is real. And it happened to many men in Millhaven. Institutionalized prisoners feel safest when confined. Grow anxious during free movement. Lose the ability to make decisions. Struggle to interpret normal human interaction. Become dependent on routine. Fear release more than incarceration. If someone has spent 20 or 30 years in a place like Millhaven, the outside world becomes overwhelming. A supermarket aisle can cause panic. A conversation without a barrier feels threatening. A large open space triggers dread. One former inmate described his first day of freedom like this: "I stood at the bus stop and felt like the world was too big. I didn't know where to put my hands. Inside Millhaven, men had very few choices. Outside, they suddenly had too many. Paradoxically, some men committed new crimes after release, not from malice, but from fear of unstructured life. One officer, hardened after decades in the system, summarized it with uncomfortable honesty. Prison teaches you to survive prison. It doesn't teach you to survive life. A world of small kindnesses, and why they mattered. Amid the harshness, something unexpected existed inside Millhaven. Moments of humanity. Small, fleeting, but powerful. A guard who quietly gave an inmate an extra bar of soap after a fight. A prisoner who shared a magazine with the men in the next cell. A chaplain who remembered someone's birthday. A kitchen worker who slipped a second piece of fruit onto a tray. An inmate who helped another learn to read. These were minor gestures, invisible in official reports. But in a world defined by deprivation, they were monumental. They reminded men, guards and inmates alike, that they were still human. One lifer who had not seen the outside world since the early 1980s described a chaplain's simple act of remembering his mother's name. That was the first time in 10 years someone spoke her name to me. I cried after he left. Moments like that didn't weaken the machine. They kept the men inside from collapsing beneath it. Because the truth is this. The hardest part of maximum security is not the violence. It is the absence of recognition. People need to be seen. Even in prison. Especially in prison. Millhaven rarely provided that. Which made the rare moments matter even more. The pressure of long sentences, time as enemy. Time behaves differently in prison. It doesn't pass, it accumulates. For men serving. Life without parole. Life with parole eligibility decades away. Indeterminate sentences. Dangerous offender designations. Time becomes a presence. A weight. An adversary. In Millhaven, long sentences created psychological fractures. 1. The compression of hope. Hope becomes something a man must ration. Too much of it leads to despair when parole hearings are denied. Too little leads to nihilism. 2. The future becomes abstract. Some inmates stop imagining the future entirely. Not out of apathy, but self-protection. 3. The past becomes myth. Memories blur. Loved ones age. Old identities fade. One inmate described his third decade behind bars by saying, "I'm not the man who was sentenced. I don't know where he went." 4. The present becomes everything. Small disputes become magnified. Minor slights become major insults. Daily routines become existential anchors. In many ways, time is the true warden of Millhaven. The guards enforce the rules. The administration enforces the structure. But time enforces the sentence. And time is merciless. Microcommunities, building family in a place without family. Humans are wired for belonging. Even in maximum security, community forms, not through choice but through necessity. These microcommunities were not gangs in the traditional sense. They were alliances of convenience, support systems, shields against isolation. Some were built around shared cultural backgrounds, shared faith, shared vulnerability, shared enemies, shared experiences from other institutions. These groups helped men navigate conflict, share resources, provide emotional grounding, build identity, survive psychologically. But they also created dependencies. If a man's group collapsed, or if he was transferred, he often felt untethered, destabilized. Some men spiraled after losing their place in these prison communities. It wasn't weakness. It was human wiring in an inhuman environment. Moments of collapse, when the machine overheats. With all this pressure, fear, routine, deprivation, identity erosion, and time, it's inevitable that some men reach a breaking point. Millhaven saw panic attacks mistaken for aggression. Self-harm mistaken for manipulation. Psychotic episodes mistaken for defiance. Withdrawals mistaken for attitude problems. Emotional shutdowns mistaken for insolence. A system built for control was rarely built for understanding. A former prison psychologist noted, In some cases, the machine didn't just fail to treat trauma, it created it. And when trauma reached a tipping point, the institution responded with the tool it knew best: segregation. Which only worsened the underlying problem. This is one of the cruel paradoxes of maximum security. The more a man suffers, the more likely he is to act out. The more he acts out, the more punishment he receives. The more punishment he receives, the more his mind deteriorates. And once the cycle begins, escape is psychological, not physical, becomes impossible. But there was still humanity, even in the machine. Not every story inside Millhaven was one of decline. Some men found resilience. Some found religion. Some found art. Some found self-discipline. Some found purpose helping others. Some found meaning in small acts, pushing back against the machine by preserving fragments of selfhood. One inmate, who spent 20 years in the maximum security wing, became known for reading constantly. Books were his rebellion. In a place that controlled everything, he chose what went into his mind. He said, "My body belonged to Millhaven. My mind didn't." Another inmate learned meditation through a chaplain's class. Guards ridiculed him at first. Other inmates mocked him. But meditation became his armor, his way of maintaining inner space that the walls could not reach. And a few guards, those rare ones who understood the difference between authority and domination, managed to create pockets of stability, where respect flowed both ways. These moments did not dismantle the machine. But they proved the machine was not absolute. Where humans exist, humanity survives. Even in Millhaven. Especially in Millhaven. If the first 3 parts of this chapter explored how Millhaven's internal ecosystem shaped daily life, its routines, its social structures, its psychological pressures, then part 4 is where the narrative turns toward reckoning. Not redemption, not healing, because those things rarely arrive in places like Millhaven. But reckoning, moments when the machine ground against its own limits, when the very forces that maintained control sparked crisis, reform, or reflection. This final portion of Chapter 3 is about the cracks in the fortress, the events that revealed the machine's vulnerability, the adaptations that followed, and the deeper question of whether a prison built on total control can coexist with the fragile, unpredictable nature of human beings. It is also where we examine the emotional strategies inmates developed to survive decades inside the walls, what happened when those strategies collapsed, and what it means to live inside a place designed not for rehabilitation but containment. By the end of this section, the contours of Millhaven's legacy become unmistakable, a place where order was achieved, but at a cost, paid not only by inmates, but by guards, communities, and the Canadian correctional system itself. The breaking point, when control creates chaos. Prisons do not erupt randomly. Moments of explosion, riots, mass assaults, collective refusals, are never sudden. They are the final snap of a pressure that has been tightening for months, even years. Millhaven was no exception. Though major riots did not tear through its early decades as they had at Kingston Penitentiary, the prison witnessed pockets of collective revolt, brief but intense flashpoints where the machine faltered. These moments often began with small grievances. A sudden restriction on yard time. A change in meal schedules. A guard accused of abusing authority. Confiscation of personal property during searches. Tensions around segregation transfers. A suicide or self-harm incident that shook the ranges. In an environment as compressed as Millhaven, such events acted like sparks dropping into a room full of fumes. One composite incident, drawn from multiple public reports over the years, illustrates the pattern. A prisoner we will call Yovan was transferred unexpectedly to segregation after a dispute with officers. Inmates believed the transfer was retaliatory. Rumors spread. Tension thickened. Within 48 hours, several ranges refused to lock up at scheduled times. Officers responded by escalating force. Inmates retaliated by flooding cells or smashing lights. This wasn't a riot. It was a warning. A reminder that control is never absolute. Guards, after the 1972 escape, often operated under the fear that they might face another organized uprising. Inmates, in turn, believed the institution would always respond to defiance with overwhelming force. This created a paradox. The very fear that prevented rebellion sometimes triggered it. Millhaven's administration understood this. Over time, crisis intervention teams were created, negotiation strategies improved, and officers were trained to distinguish between defiance and desperation. But the truth remained. A maximum security prison's greatest threat was often not violence, it was the psychology of containment. Moments of human collapse, when men couldn't hold the line. For some inmates, stress did not explode outward. It imploded. It is one thing to manage daily tension. It is another to live under it for years, even decades. Men who initially adapted to Millhaven's pressure sometimes found their internal scaffolding weakening over time. Common triggers included news of a loved one's death, parole denial after decades of waiting, fear of retaliation from another inmate, prolonged isolation, transfer to segregation for unclear reasons, lingering unresolved trauma from childhood or previous institutions. One inmate, pseudonym Archer, spent 17 years in maximum security. He had a reputation as composed, intelligent, and respectful. Guards considered him predictable, one of the easy inmates. But when Archer received a letter informing him that his mother had passed away, he spiraled. Inmates saw the signs before staff did. Archer stopped speaking. He stopped eating. He paced his cell relentlessly. He reread the letter until the paper tore. He began talking to himself. Within a week, he was found collapsed on the range during morning unlock, shaking violently. Some inmates believed he was experiencing a mental health crisis. Others believed he was having a seizure brought on by stress and hunger. Guards escorted him to medical, and from there, to segregation for observation. Segregation, the very place that had broken so many men, was now the response to someone breaking. Archer survived. But he was never the same. He told a chaplain months later. Millhaven didn't kill my mother. But it killed who I was when she died. His story was not unique. Men broke quietly, invisibly. The machine didn't notice until something snapped. Coping mechanisms, how men survived the machine. To endure Millhaven meant developing psychological armor. Some armor was functional. Some was destructive. All of it was adaptive. Below are the most common survival strategies prisoners developed, and what they reveal about the human psyche under extreme restriction. 1. Emotional numbing, the armor of detachment. Prison is not a place where emotions flourish. Emotional expression can be interpreted as weakness, provocation, or instability. So many inmates learned to shut down their emotional lives almost completely. They practiced blank expressions. They responded in monotone. They buried grief, anger, fear. Psychologists call this phenomenon flattened affect. Inmates called it turning cold. One lifer said, "If you feel nothing, nothing can hurt you." But emotional numbing comes with a cost. Many men eventually forgot how to access their feelings at all, even when they needed to connect with family, to attend parole hearings, to rebuild a sense of self. 2. Hyperfocus on routine. Some men anchored their sanity in exact, repetitive routines. Doing push-ups at the same times each day. Cleaning their cell in the same sequence. Folding clothes to perfect geometric order. Reading for a set number of hours. Writing daily journal entries. Pacing in patterns. Routine gave structure in a place designed to overwhelm. But it also meant that any disruption, a lockdown, a fight, a late count, could shatter a man's sense of order. 3. Mental escape through imagination. Some inmates survived by mentally stepping outside the walls. They developed rich internal worlds. Fantasies of freedom. Reimagined hometowns. Invented futures. Conversations with loved ones imagined as present. Hyper-detailed visualizations of places they had never seen. This coping mechanism was powerful, but risky. If imagination became more real than reality, reintegration became nearly impossible.